And I'm looking forward to the conversation with my dear brother, Ibram.
And let me say, Bernadette, in many ways, I think that your work and your activism, and certainly the work and activism of your students and your allies, is a healing sort of agent, I suspect, for many people. So in certain ways, you did become a doctor,
All right, I'll
uh,
take it.
and and even in a way, sort of figuring out how to engineer. Uh, Ensuring that families and individuals could help to become sort of whole again, particularly with their homes. It certainly has seems like it's been part of your mission as well. So I mean, you were all you. I don't think you disgraced because you in a way became all three: engineer, lawyer, doctor, and so I'm just proud to just be in conversation with you about this book and really this mission. And I first want to just send a shout out to the squatters because in many ways their activism, their place sort of led you down the path, to this work. But I want to return first to something you said in your opening remarks that I think many people were struck by, and when you said individual efforts are no match for broken systems. Can you just sort of speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah. In the book, again, I tell stories and I tell the story of Myrisha. And Myrisha, I'm telling you, she's superhuman. The amount of work she does to try and rehabilitate her grandparents' home, right? She's running around trying to pay the taxes, getting connected with various programs, and she pays them down. But because they're illegally inflated, she can't then keep up with them. And because the state of Michigan charges an 18% interest penalty on all delinquent property tax debt, it just creates, it just creates a never-ending cycle of debt. And that 18% interest penalty makes sense if people have the money. And the point is that they just don't want to pay it. But putting an 18% interest penalty on poor people who don't pay because they don't have it just makes the situation worse. And that's what you see in the book is just Myrisha trying to juggle because of all her caretaking responsibilities. She's trying to juggle so much. She's trying to do so much, right? She's facing employment discrimination at work. So she's coming in and out of employment. But she is doing everything humanly possible to save her home. And in the end, she ends up losing her home, right? Despite the fact that, her superhuman efforts. And that's because individual efforts are no match for broken systems.
Indeed, and your book beautifully was able to move between the structural and its personal, deep personal impact, as you stated. And and I'm happy in your talk you even just spoke and sort of highlighted the level of shame when
Yes.
Black people are not able to, or other people are not able to be superhuman. So we're literally we're operating within a structure that compels us to be superhuman, and then when we're not able to be anything but human, we end up sort of blaming ourselves. And it sounds like you heard that over and over again
Yeah,
from.
Ibram, that was probably one of the most powerful findings of the research is this, these narratives of personal irresponsibility. And again, it wasn't just the um, government officials who were using these narratives of personal responsibility, but people internalized it, right? People who were victim to these illegally inflated property taxes internalized this narrative as well, and that's the danger of it. And that's the work for people who are committed to racial justice. And as the dean said, we have a mandatory course at USC called Race, Racism, and the Law. Every student has to take it in order to graduate. And so I'm teaching it this semester. And I always teach my students our job as people who are committed to racial justice is about always pointing out the structural injustice. It's a discursive move. It's about shifting from these narratives of personal irresponsibility to narratives of structural injustice, right? Anytime we hear these narratives of personal irresponsibility, we should be like, okay, where's the structural injustice, right? And we should move the conversation to that. And so, it's this kind of discursive move of moving from, again, narratives of personal irresponsibility to structural injustice that freed people of that shame, Ibram, right? It was like people were beating themselves up. But once they know, oh, okay, they were overtaxing me, I didn't know that, right? And now what shame does is forces you to hide and to go to a corner and be quiet. But while now you know that there was a structural injustice and you were being overassessed and this property tax exemption, all these unnecessary barriers were being elevated to prevent you from getting the property tax exemption. Now we can move from a place of shame to a place of righteous indignation, right? So now we can start the fight back. But you have to do the work. Before you can start the fight back, you have to do that work of shifting the narrative. Again, from the narrative of personal irresponsibility to these narratives of structural injustice, identifying the racist policies.
Indeed, and a son of Detroit and Michigan more broadly, Brother Malcolm, I can still remember that day in which he spoke in front of a crowd of Black people and said, "Who taught you to hate yourself?" And the way in which those internalized racist ideas prevent people from seeing that structure which you so brutally outlined. But going back to this sort of these narratives of personal irresponsibility, I suspect one narrative that we probably should also push to the side is, well, why didn't they just sue?
Right.
Like,
Yes.
how would you
Let's
answer
talk
that?
about that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So the point is there was a lawsuit. There was a lawsuit called Morningside, and we had some of the most, fancy public interest lawyers. It was the ACLU of Michigan. It was the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and for the deep pockets, the Washington, D.C. firm of Covington and Burling. And they brought two claims. One was a claim against the city of Detroit for this obstructive administration of the poverty tax exemption that I'm talking about, all of those barriers they put to people getting the poverty tax exemption. And the second claim was against Wayne County for it was a Fair Housing Act claim, because in the Fair Housing Act is one of the few places where disparate impact is still alive and well. So it was a disparate impact case showing that the Black communities in Wayne County were being overassessed and foreclosed on at a much greater rate than the white cities. And so the Fair Housing Act claim went before Judge Colombo, and Judge Colombo says, you brought that state court. He said, no, you weren't supposed to bring it to state court. You were supposed to bring this to the Michigan Tax Tribunal. So the legal team appeals to the appellate court, and the appellate court agrees with the lower court. Then it goes to the Michigan Supreme Court, and they deny cert. So the lower court decision stands. And this lower court decision saying that it's called improper venue. You should have brought it to the Michigan Tax Tribunal, kills the case for three reasons. Number one, the Michigan Tax Tribunal is not a court. It's an administrative agency. And the judges aren't even lawyers. A lot of times they're real estate appraisers, etc. And so because it's not a court, it doesn't have injunctive power. And that was the main thing the case was asking for the city and for the county to stop doing something. But it doesn't have injunctive power. Also, because it's an administrative agency and not a court, it doesn't have a class action, right? So if you bring something to the Michigan Tax Tribunal, you have to go one by one by one. It can cure individual harm, but not the systemic harm that the Morningside case was going after. And number three, in order to bring something before the Michigan Tax Tribunal at this time, you had to bring it between February 1st and February 15th. You had 15 days, where the Fair Housing Act gives you 2 years to put together all of the evidence that you need to do a disparate impact case. And so for that reason, this procedural judgment kills the case, right? And so although we have all of this data showing these racial disparities, it has never to this day been heard by a court. So that was state court. So then you might ask, well, why didn't they go to federal court? Well, they couldn't go to federal court because of a federal statute called the Tax Injunction Act, which prevents the federal courts from listening to cases that affect the tax collection at the state level. So again, because of these procedural issues, this very clear illegality has never been heard by a court. And I'm a law professor, and we teach our students when there's an illegality, you take it to court and fix it up. We don't teach them about instances like this where there are procedural barriers that prevent communities from getting justice. The good news is the second claim, the claim against for obstructive administration of the poverty tax exemption against the city of Detroit, that did move forward, and that settled. And now we have the settlement was robust. And not only did we get the settlement in Detroit, but now the whole state of Michigan altered the way it deals with the poverty tax exemption. There's now a way, so many, I can go on and on, so many good things came from that lawsuit. So at the moment, there's still a long way to go, but now that poverty tax exemption I was talking about is accessible to people more so than it was in the past as a result of the lawsuit.
One of the terms you decided to use in your book was the term racist policies.
Yes.
Can you sort of share specifically, why you decided to
Yes.
use
Well,
that term and how you consider that to be a discursive sort of shift?
yes. Actually, to be perfectly honest, you're the influence behind that. When I read Stamp from the Beginning, when I read your work, you convinced me, like talking about and how to be an anti-racist, right? So talking about the difference between talking about racist policies and structural injustice, when you talk about, structural injustice or systemic injustice or institutional racism or structural racism or systemic racism, right? That's so overwhelming. It's just overwhelming. What can I do about that? But when we change our language and start, number one, talking about racist policies, but even more importantly, we need to start enumerating the policies that are undergirding the racial injustice. Once we do that, now we can begin a conversation about how to disassemble those policies. So for instance, in the case of this overtaxation in Detroit, we have several policies at work, race neutral policies that are causing a racialized effect, right? Number one is the fact that Michigan as a state uses averages, which by definition, right, an average means that lower valued homes are undervalued and higher valued homes are undervalued and lower valued homes are overvalued, right? And who's living in overvalued homes because of intersectionality, right? We're thinking about people of color, women, poor people. And so that's one specific policy, this policy of using averages. And again, I became a Michigan assessor, so I know all of this very well. Another policy is the policy, very specific policy I just told you about the state of Michigan putting an 18% interest penalty on the property taxes, right? And I can go on, but once we switch our language from systemic racism to racist policies, that forces the speaker, right, the one who's articulating it, to really articulate the very specific policies undergirding the racial injustice. And again, once we do that, now we can have a conversation about how to disassemble those racist policies.
I'm a little biased, but I agree.
Yeah.
No, but I think we can have a conversation with regular people, right? Okay, because they'll ask the question, what rule are you talking about? What policy? And then we can certainly
That's right.
then encourage them to read Plundered,
Right.
in which they could sort of learn that. You write in your book, homeowners in Detroit are playing an extremely destructive game of musical chairs, some willfully and others not. Tragically, it has left the city and its longtime inhabitants bruised and scarred in the fight for that last chair. Can you just sort of explain and unpack that phenomenon?
Yeah. So even this whole story I just told you all about Myrisha, right? So she is fighting like hell to keep her grandparents home because it's again a broken system. She ends up getting evicted from that home, but she then goes to her mother's house, and then after COVID she goes out to find a house, and the house she finds is a house that someone else got taken from someone else through tax foreclosure, right? And so that's the cycle. Like someone gets evicted, they were an owner, they go to rent something else, and the rental that they have is a rental because some other family was tax foreclosed and evicted from that home. And that's why in Detroit used to be the Black homeownership capital of America.
Yeah.
And Detroit has transitioned from being a majority homeowner city to a majority renter city. And this has a lot to do with the multiple waves of dispossession, starting with, again, and we really need to start with with the mortgage foreclosure. And let me say that for a second here, because, what's happening here is in 2008, at the Great Recession, there was basically all property values fell, right? But property values in Black and brown communities took a really precipitous dive because of the predatory lending that was happening, right? The misbehavior of the corporations, the misbehavior of the banks. And those property taxes didn't recover. And in Detroit, it was at the very same time that the city is going through the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history. And again, so they just don't have the capacity to change the home values to match those the new home values, right? And we have to be careful how we tell that story, because you can tell that story about, one way to tell the story is, like there's something wrong with the bureaucrats in the city of Detroit. But we have to come out and look at the other layers, right? We need to look at the fact that, again, we had these banks and the predatory loans that made the property values drop in the first place, that required the city, right? So if we're not careful, we just locate the problem in the city. And what I'm encouraging us to do is to always look at the other layers. Let's look at the banks. Let's look at the fact that federal funding to localities has been decreasing over the years. Forcing cities to provide the same level of services with wells that are ever drier. And so we need to look at the federal government's role. We need to look at the role of corporations. We can't just look at this injustice in the city and blame it on the bureaucrats in the city. If we do that, that's a very dangerous discourse.
Indeed, and to also, I also want, if you can, to speak a little bit about how developers have profited, from this predatory governance. You tell the story of Ebony, a Black woman who loses her family's home, in Detroit. Her home is foreclosed. It's bought at auction for $6,000. It's flipped and resold 1 year later for $45,000.
Yes, yeah. And again, the home Ebony bought, the reason she was able to buy it at such a low rate is because, and again, she found this out from the neighborhood, there was an older lady who was in that house who was subject to mortgage foreclosure. So that's how Ebony even got her house at that low price. And then again, the investors came in. So yeah, and so part of the work I do is I'm looking at so part of the work that I do in the book is really answering following the money. I always say, when you want to find the core of any problem, you need to follow the money, okay? Mm-hmm. And so when you follow the money, it's not the city of Detroit that's making profit from this, illegally inflating the property taxes. They're losing money, right? They're losing property tax revenue. Anytime a house is foreclosed, it reduces the value of the neighboring home. It's causing blight. The city of Detroit is not gaining financially. So who is gaining financially? And the book tells the story. The answer is Wayne County. Right? So at the very same time that Detroit is going through the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history, Wayne County is also in a financial emergency. And Wayne County saves itself from bankruptcy and emergency management on the backs of delinquent delinquent property tax homeowners in Detroit, because what happens is any time there's a delinquency in property taxes, it goes into something called the Delinquent Tax Revolving Fund, and that's the very same fund that Wayne County used to save itself from, again, bankruptcy and emergency management. So when you look at, and again, in that delinquent tax revolving fund goes that 18% interest that I told you about earlier. And so that's who is a big entity making money. But there's also, as you notice, not only Wayne County is making the most money, but there's a lot of investors who are making money off of these homes, buying them and flipping them, et cetera. So, and there's also, and it's a diverse story. There's the investors come from lots of places. There's a lot of, for some reason, there's a lot of investors from Argentina. I don't know what happened there, right? There's a lot of investors from other countries. There's a lot of investors from all over the nation. There's a lot of investors from the suburbs, right, who are making a lot of money off of property tax delinquency and foreclosure in Detroit.
I just
And
want
it's
to.
also local Detroiters making money,
Oh
right?
yeah.
So it's a diverse group of people making money from this tragedy.
And everyone will take questions from everyone. So if anybody want to drop any questions, in the chat, I'll turn to your questions in a bit. But one of the last questions I want to ask before we turn to the questions from the audience is your book in many ways follows uh, these two sort of personal stories. A black uh, sort of a black homeowner and a white homeowner who both arrived sort of at the same time, to Detroit, worked at the same and pretty much the same job at the Ford Motor Company. But 3 decades later, one is, in a valuable house, comfortably sort of located, while the other it has spent a bunch of money just to keep up the house and ultimately forecloses, on it. And I just want to sort of ask the decision to pursue sort of that form of storytelling, and how do you think it helped the reader to sort of see how, depending on your racial identity or even your place, how sort of these larger racist policies are affecting your sort of life chances.
Yeah. So, that Ibram wasn't even a choice I kind of made. That chose me. So what do I mean by that? I was doing the research for the book and I was interviewing my main character, Myrisha, and then I was interviewing Robert Ficano, and they both were talking a lot about their grandfathers. And so I started kind of asking more questions, and I discovered that both of their grandfathers started at the Ford Motor Company's River Rouge foundry around the same time. I discovered that both of their grandfathers were sharecroppers, one from North Carolina, one from Italy. And so I was like, wait, what? Right. And so then once I found that, again, there were these symmetries, that's when I decided to use that as my narrative hook. But I didn't know that I had already started writing and had to rewrite once I did the research and found that these similarities. And I think it's a really powerful narrative hook because it helps just the everyday American see what's happening, right? It helps them see that, all right, you have these two gentlemen, they started off in the same place, right? Because the Italians, they didn't have, he left Italy after World War II. He worked in France's coal mines. His grandfather even had a missing thumb because it got cut off in a work accident. So it's not like the white Italian grandfather had an easy life. So you can see that they both started in poverty and both had difficult lives. But his name is Grandpa Bucci, is the Italian grandfather, and Grandpa Brown is the black grandfather. What Grandpa Bucci never had to deal with is racially restrictive covenants. What Grandpa Bucci never had to deal with is redlining, right? So what are those? Racially restrictive covenants are covenants that were tucked in deeds that said black people couldn't live in certain houses, right? And so Grandpa Bucci, while he's working at Ford River Rouge factory, he moves to the suburbs. He moves to Redford. But Grandpa Brown could not follow him to Redford because of the racially restrictive covenants. And it's important to know that in the suburbs, the houses were cheaper, larger, right? And had more amenities. So you wanted to be in the suburbs, but blacks couldn't go to the suburbs because of racially restrictive covenants. And then in the neighborhoods that blacks were corralled in, right, because they couldn't go to certain neighborhoods because of these covenants, then the federal government, through the Fair Housing Administration, draws a red line around the communities that blacks have been marooned in. And they draw a red line saying that these communities are a high credit risk. And so these communities don't get investment. So they don't get mortgages. They don't get home improvement loans. And so, of course, Myrisha inherits this dilapidated home. It's not a coincidence. It's because of these systemic policies, these racist policies that, choked investment from black communities. When you don't have home repair loans, of course the homes are going to be dilapidated. And so it just shows that although Grandpa Bucci didn't have an easy life, he never had to deal with racial covenants. He never had to deal with redlining. He was not uprooted from his community because of urban renewal. Right? He never had to deal with block busting, which is when you had a situation where black people move in and these shady intermediaries then say, hey, the blacks are coming. And it doesn't matter, even if the white person is, it doesn't matter how they feel about blacks. The point is, because of redlining, the mere presence of black people will, in fact, reduce home values. Redlining made black people pariahs. And so the actual coming of black people because of redlining would, in fact, reduce their home values. So they would sell at fire sale prices, and then the intermediary would resell to the black families at an inflated price. That's blockbusting, right? So although, again, you see that these two men came from hard scrabble starting points, but Grandpa Bucci never had to deal with these racist policies that I'm talking about. And then we see the difference in their progeny. We see the difference in their descendants as a result of their ability to accumulate wealth because they were not assaulted by all of these racist policies we've been talking about.
Yeah, and the black grandfather, as you mentioned earlier, and his descendants can end up feeling this sense of shame because they think what happened is because there's something wrong with them. And then on the flip side, right, that white grandfather and their descendants could end up feeling a sense of pride because they think there's something right about them. So it almost reinforces the notions of both inferiority and superiority simultaneously,
Right.
all the while.
And on that point too, we have these narratives in America about I have what I had because I worked hard.
Yep.
And what the book, putting these two grandfathers side by side, showed that both grandfathers worked hard.
Yeah.
They both worked hard, right? But because of these racist policies, we have different outcomes, okay? So so this kind of like hard work narrative, it kind of undermines and adds some complexity to that as well.
Indeed. So let me jump. People have a tremendous number of questions. I think they're really interested, in this topic. But
meanwhile, give me a second. I'm over here hot flashing. Lord Jesus.
Oh, I agree. Take your time. I mean, you're on fire. That's why.
It's that time of life is what's happening. Whew. All right, y'all.
So,
Work with me.
one person asked how your previous work in South Africa, impacted your work here and your approach in Detroit.
Yeah, excellent question. So one of my book in South Africa develops two concepts. One is called a dignity taking. And that's the idea that when I take something, the point is to give that thing back at the moment of compensation. But there are other instances where I take something as part of a larger strategy of dehumanization or infantilization. In those instances, I've taken something more than property. I've also taken your dignity. And I call that a dignity taking. And the argument goes that when this larger harm called a dignity taking has occurred, required, mere reparations are not enough. What's required is a more robust remedy that I call dignity restoration. And that's the process of giving people, of putting dispossessed individuals and communities in the driver's seat and allowing them to determine how it is they're made whole. So you all heard me talking about, and you'll hear my dear brother Chintan Maru, who's coming on a little bit later in the program, talk about the Dignity Restoration Project. And that's what we are in Detroit in our this program we're trying to do to raise $10 million to compensate the hardest hit. We're using this idea of dignity restoration that I developed in South Africa. And I developed these two concepts based on the South Africa case study. But now over 30 different scholars have taken these concepts and applied it to different case studies across history, across geography. And so what we're doing is, again, using these concepts as part of our organizing for healing in Detroit.
That makes sense. And so someone else asks, what's the phenomenon of predatory governance, and what does this issue look like in the country at large? And I suspect they've been watching the news and probably, asking that question, like how would you think of predatory governance, in the broadest and even in national sense?
Yeah. I mean, look, there's so many instances of predatory governance. I'm talking about property taxes. I gave you the instance of Ferguson, but I can give you so many more. Let's look at abuses of civil forfeiture. Right? You can think about what you want about civil forfeiture, but the abuse of civil forfeiture. There's a case out of D.C. where, in fact, what the D.C. Police Department was doing is they would take someone's car when they believed it was part of a crime, but in order to even challenge the taking, you had to pay a $2,500 bond, which meant that poor people didn't stand a chance of even challenging this civil forfeiture. And so who made money off of this abuse of civil forfeiture? That was the police department who profited from the abuse of civil forfeiture. Not any corrupt individual. It was public coffers that benefited. We see, and we've had civil forfeiture cases in abuse of civil forfeiture cases all around the country. Philadelphia is a big offender there as well. We have the example of New Orleans. In New Orleans, there was a situation where the courts basically, when you're poor, you can't jail people for being poor. And so you're supposed to do an ability to pay hearing. The judges weren't doing the ability to pay hearing and charging these people fees and fines that they could not pay. Who benefited from the fees and fines? Those fees and fines were keeping going into the court, right, to keep the court alive. And so, again, and who's being affected? Mostly Black and brown people. And again, who's benefiting? Not some individual, but it's the public purse that's benefiting. And that's the conversation I'm trying to start with, this conversation about predatory governance. I'm trying to look at the ways in which Black and brown people are being taxed, they're being fined, they're being, right? And the entity benefiting is not some corrupt public official, but it's the public purse itself. And we need to start talking about that because there's a trend happening. What I found in Detroit is one example of a larger phenomenon happening in America that, again, our country is not yet talking about. And so I created this term predatory governance so we can begin that very important conversation.
Great. And what do you see as the connection, someone else asked, between inflated property taxes, particularly in majority Black cities, and gentrification?
Ooh, that's a good one. Man, it's a mechanism. That's the answer. It's a mechanism, right? It's these inflated property taxes that lead to people losing their homes, right? And a lot of times, even if these homes are paid off, people can't pay the property taxes. And so it's a mechanism for dispossession of Black and brown families. And then, again, others move in. So It's one of the gentrification has so many different mechanisms. What
Yeah.
I want us to understand is this is one of the mechanisms of gentrification, of how you come to a gentrified area.
So this is a technical question, but someone asked, what is the connection between the Detroit Land Bank and property tax injustice?
Ooh, that's a good one too. So basically, what's happening is, and I tell this story in the book, a longer story about the land bank. But essentially, what happens is that when you don't pay your property taxes, a lot of times the treasurer tries to sell the homes. And for some reason, if the homes don't sell, meaning if they're, they just have, it takes more to rehabilitate the home than the home is worth, then the home comes to the land bank. So the land bank owns a lot of homes, right? They have possession of a lot of homes. And the reason they have possession is because those homes were tax foreclosed. So that's the connection, is the land bank is holding a lot of homes, right? That were, and their inventory is so large because of tax foreclosure.
Someone else asked, what is happening with taxable value increasing over CPI inflation in 2024, 2025 in Detroit? And is this constitutional? If you could first also just say that what they're asking in lay terms
Yeah, yeah,
for
yeah,
those
yeah.
of us who.
So, right, in Michigan, there's a constitutional provision that prevents property taxes from increasing either by the rate of inflation or 5%, right? And so you have your assessed value, and your assessed value is basically whatever the home is, 50% of what the home is worth. So if your home is worth $100,000, your assessed value is worth $50,000. So that's what assessed value. And taxable value takes the assessed value and does this thing about not letting that assessed value increase by more than inflation or 5%, inflation or 5%. And so basically over the years, it's always just been inflation. But now since inflation is so high, for the first time, that 5% limit is kicking in. But it is legal. That is the constitutional provision that they have to, the assessed value can't increase more than, again, than inflation or 5%, whichever is less. So that's more inside baseball than we
Okay.
probably want to get into with this national crowd. I don't know.
Well, I mean, somebody wanted to be a little inside baseball. So,
I know.
we
It's
jumped
okay.
in there with y'all.
All right. All
Um,
right.
so someone else asked, how do you view now, after conducting all your research and even activism, the holdover squatter dynamic, as they call it, for people impacted by property tax foreclosure?
Yeah. So, I am, so obviously I came to Detroit to really study squatting, and I actually am eager to get back to that project because there was a lot of that project was on its way. But I do ethnography, so I live in the place I study, so I couldn't keep doing squatting when all my neighbors were losing their homes from property tax foreclosure, so I had to put that squatting project aside. But in terms of takeovers, the point is there are some interesting findings in my squatting project. So one of the findings was, you would think that people who are squatting, because a lot of times when you squat, it's like broken windows, it's not safe, because if you entered the house, someone else can enter the house.
Yeah.
So you would think that people who are squatting are the poorest of the poor, the most marginalized, people who don't have social capital. They can't sit on go to grandmama's house couch or a homie's couch, right? So kind of people who are on the fringes of society, what was my hypothesis, are the ones who are squatting. But what my data revealed is that no, you actually have to have a great deal of social capital to squat, because that's how you keep safe. A lot of people go back and squat in the communities they know because, my neighbors are watching out for me and I'm watching out for my neighbors, right?
Mm.
So that was one. So I came in with one hypothesis and the data kind of showed something else. So I am excited. Obviously, I have to finish up what I'm doing. I have this book that's out. I got to write one more book about the fight back, about all of this org. I
All right.
couldn't fit that in this book. I was at Ibram, I was at 160,000 words, and they were like, you got to cut to 100,000. I was like, wait, what? Like, so I was like, this is clearly 2 books because I'm not even finished writing. And y'all talking about I got to cut it back. So this book is about the problem. The next book is going to be about the fight back and all of the community organizing that we're doing to solve the problem. And then I want to come back to this book on squatting, which is, again, how I started this whole thing in the first place.
Okay. And I think if anyone is like me, I suspect they're really outraged, about this injustice, and you're maybe even asking, like, what can we do? What can folks do to help?
Right, right. So at this point, yes, what can you do to help? I want to bring on and introduce my dear brother, Chintan Maru, who's the CEO of GDI, Global Development Incubator, which is a platform that helps to launch and scale transformative social impact ventures. Chintan serves as the founding team and board member of the Dignity Restoration Project. And so he's going to come on and tell you all a little bit about, we call DRP, Dignity Restoration Project, how you can get involved, how you can help. If what you heard here outraged you and you want to do something, Chintan is going to talk about what exactly you can do. The floor is yours, Chin.
Thank you so much, Professor Bernadette. And people asked, I saw in the chat, where's the hope? What can we do? And I want to speak to that. My colleagues have mapped over 400 reparative efforts across the country, and most of those are research commissions documenting historic harms. And this work, like Bernadette's research, is a critical step toward repair. And eventually, we hope to see those 400 plus commissions move from research to action. And when they do, they will need a blueprint. How do you design reparations with community input? How do you establish eligibility for compensation? How do you raise money from governments and donors? And how do you manage those funds to compensate households individually with integrity? The Dignity Restoration Project is establishing that operational blueprint for a growing national movement toward racial repair, starting in Detroit. If you believe in the importance of racial repair, and if you believe in your own power to help build a thriving multiracial democracy, please join us. We need your support. You can support with your voice, telling people about what happened in Detroit, and you can support financially by donating to the Dignity Restoration Project's compensation fund. Your contribution, just like Professor said, tells people like Myrisha, I see you. I affirm your dignity. To learn more and to contribute, please visit dignityrestorationproject.org, and you can see the QR code as well on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Chin. Thank you. All right, this brings us to the conclusion of our program.
Yes.
I just want to just thank you, Ibram. This brother right here has shown up for me so big, and I adore you and thank you for being my conversation partner here and just being such a cheerleader and supporter of this book. Thank you, my dear brother. Thank you.
Of course, and thank you for showing up for the people of Detroit. For the people who've suffered this gross injustice. With your dedicated research passion and activism. And I just want to ask one last question to sort of send us off, and that is, like, what has given you hope? What has fueled you? Through everything you've done during this process?
Yeah. So before I went to law school, I was a community organizer in South Central LA at COCO. So for those of you who know the Community Coalition. And, when I saw this injustice, the organizer in me couldn't, because, as professors, we just write books and then we keep it moving. I couldn't just keep it moving. And that's actually, it's the working in community, it's the organizing that gives me hope and gives me life.
Mm.
And so I couldn't just do this research because what I just talked to you about was depressing.
Yeah.
So I could not do this research without also doing the community organizing and the community work. We have, again, at the Coalition for Property Tax Justice, we have the most amazing group of leaders who, again, they give me life. They give me hope. It's like working in, we have every first Saturday at the Coalition, we have something called Coffee and Story. Every first Saturday of the month, we have something called Coffee and Stories, where different people we all get together, offer people resources who are going through property tax foreclosure. But most importantly, the Coffee and Stories is a healing space. It's a space to, again, tell your story. And at Coffee and Stories, people find out, oh my God, that happened to me too. I'm not alone. Right. And at Coffee and Stories is where the shame starts to lift, where people are like, okay, I thought this was me, but there's something. And to see people connect the dots and to see that veil of shame lift from people gives me life. It gives me life. And so that's what gives me hope, is just being in community with people and not only identifying a problem, but identifying solutions and fighting side by side with community to implement those solutions.
Well, thank you. And please, everyone, we spoke tonight about this incredible book,
Yes.
Plundered, and thank you, Bernadette.
Out today. Get the book. Get the book. Get the book, y'all.
All right, everyone, have a good evening. Thank you again so much, Bernadette, for this jewel of a book.
Thank you, Ibram. Thank you. Bye, everybody. Thanks for coming.